Chapter 3. At Fob Tetris, Team D.O.G's forward operating base in Afghanistan, Captain Tim Stewart, Zach's and JJ's company commander, struggled with the news brought to him by his brigade commander, Colonel Grant Sullivan. Captain Stewart could not accept that the members of his best sniper team were dead, but he had been instructed to ship home Zach's and JJ's personal belongings. To him, packing their gear and belongings was an admission of their deaths, a task made difficult because he refused to believe the news. He carefully placed each item in its box and thought about what could have gone wrong. He began second-guessing the hours spent preparing for the mission. What did we overlook? His thoughts shifted to the series of events that led to his learning of the deaths of his men. Captain Stewart had stood in his Base Defense Operations Center, or BDOC, and listened to JJ radio Blackjack 1-2 to alert him of a successful mission. And, after hearing the call, he left the BDOC believing the team to be on their way to the extraction point. When they didn't return from the mission in the time planned, he rushed to the helicopter squadron to ensure their calls were received. And when he arrived, the squadron commander, Major Tony Phillips, met him. "Did you hear Team D.O.G.?" Captain Stewart asked.
"We did," Major Phillips responded. "We heard them contact Blackjack 1-2. They never radioed Red Sky 6. We waited, knowing they would be contacting us when they reached the extraction point. They never call for an extraction, and we can't risk a bird and its crew until we know they are alive and waiting for us."
Captain Stewart left the squadron area with his head down. He understood Major Phillips not wanting to risk his men and equipment unnecessarily, but he didn't understand why his sniper team radioed only Blackjack 1-2 and not the extraction team. The only explanation was that they never reached the extraction point, and as he approached his command area, Colonel Sullivan, the captain's brigade commander, asked him into his office.
"I'm sorry to have to tell you this, Tim," Colonel Sullivan said, "but I just received word your sniper team was captured and killed. Please see to it their personal belongings are sent to their families."
Captain Stewart stopped in his tracks when he heard this. It was not long ago he heard JJ's voice calling to report a successful mission. Now, he was being told they were captured and killed. "How do you know, sir?" he asked Colonel Sullivan.
"I've received word from higher up. The terrorists in the region made an immediate public broadcast of the capture and deaths of a sniper team in the mountains overlooking the Swat Valley area. Your men were the only snipers in Pakistan, so the conclusion is it was your team."
"Any video, sir?" Captain Stewart asked.
"No, there wasn't."
Dejection set in as Captain Stewart replayed JJ's radio call in his head, focusing on the tone in his voice. He heard nothing to indicate JJ was in any danger, and for them to have been killed soon after their first radio call meant they would have had to have been in danger when he made his call or immediately after. They could have been killed making their way to the extraction point, but he would not have believed that likely either. They were the most skilled snipers in the Marine Corps, and no one could capture them unless... He paused in mid-thought, running a timeline through his head. The capture of his team would have had to happen soon after they contacted Blackjack 1-2, and this puzzled and troubled him. Snipers sometimes were spotted, but seldom as quickly as his team would have to have been. To make this more confusing, he knew the team would be positioned high up the mountains, a long distance from the kill zone. The distance would be easy enough for the kill shot, but too far for them to be seen by the naked eye. For them to have been captured so soon after the kill, someone would have had to alert the captors that they were in the mountains. The captors would not need to know the exact location, but they would have to know the general area to be close enough to the hunting spot to look and listen for the shot. Everything told Captain Stewart his team was taken captive, and he believed they were. The unanswered question was, why? No matter, he refused to accept they were dead. It was his experience that terrorists always included video of the killings of American military personnel. It was how they showed off their trophies. Because there was no video of Zach's and JJ's deaths, he remained convinced his men were alive. Of course, his belief could be the result of wishful thinking, but he had too many unanswered questions, and each missing answer added to his conclusion that his team was alive. Sir, I don't believe Gunny Hinson and Sergeant Jones are dead. I would prefer not to send their belongings home until we have absolute confirmation of their deaths. Doing so would only put the families through unnecessary grief. Colonel Sullivan placed his hand on Captain Stewart's shoulder. The President has already sent letters of condolence to the families, Tim, so they will be expecting the belongings. He's already notified the families? Captain Stewart asked in shocked belief. Sending letters to the families of deceased military personnel is something the President has the option to do, Colonel Sullivan said. I know, sir. He paused, trying to gather his thoughts. What is it, Tim? Colonel Sullivan asked with a concerned tone in his voice. Sir, I'm not convinced they are dead. I believe the President has acted prematurely. Why? No video, sir. The terrorists always want to show off their trophies. If they had killed Gunny Hinson and Sergeant Jones, they would have tortured them first, and they would have included a video of the torture as part of their broadcast. I understand, the colonel said. Terrorists hate our military and take every opportunity to show the world their disdain. Unfortunately, the President's action has this out of our hands. Captain Stewart nearly dropped the subject, but decided he couldn't, opting instead to act on his instincts. Sir, request permission to lead a search and rescue mission to find Team D.O.G. and bring them home. Colonel Sullivan's head drew back before he released a long breath. Let's not do this, Tim. You pack the belongings and get them ready for shipment. Sleep on it tonight and make certain you believe the mission would be worth the risk for the men who would be on it. If you feel the same in the morning, see me. I'm not promising I'll approve it, or that I can. I just need time to consider it. Thank you, sir. Captain Stewart snapped to attention and turned to walk off. Now he faced the task of shipping home Zach's and JJ's personal belongings. He could have instructed another Marine to do the packing, but he decided doing it would give him the time alone to develop the rescue plan he would have to present to the colonel. He neared completion of his task when Sergeant Roy Edwards came into the room. Sergeant Edwards had been a Marine for 5 years and was a machine gunner for his 3rd platoon. I'm sorry, sir. I heard something and was checking on it, he said as he started to close the door. I'll leave you alone. That's okay, Sergeant. Come on in. Sergeant Edwards eyed him closely. What's wrong, sir? Captain Stewart wondered how he should answer the question. He hadn't yet announced the news of the deaths to the rest of his company, and now, believing there might be the possibility of a search and rescue mission, he might not do it at all. Nothing. Just checking on something, he finally answered. Roger, sir. I'll leave you alone. Sergeant Edwards stood at attention and left the room. The instant the sergeant left the room, Captain Stewart decided he needed to tell the Marines under his command the news. He left the room and walked to his first sergeant's location. First Sergeant, gather the company. I have some news to share with everyone. Yes, sir. And, First Sergeant, let's keep this informal. In the barracks. Yes, sir. The man headed off. Captain Stewart took his time and gathered his thoughts as he made his way to the barracks. Attention! Officer on deck! The first sergeant announced. In unison, the men in the room stood and came to attention. As you were, Captain Stewart said, and the men returned to their seated position. He stood in silence and glanced around. The captain used that time to honor each one of his Marines and further collect his thoughts before he started to speak. He needed to make the announcement, but found it troublesome to say the words, because he believed they were not true. I have some disturbing news. He paused and took a breath. I just learned from Brigade. Captain Stewart paused. He refused to use the words told to him. Team D.O.G was captured and killed. They had too strong a sense of finality about them. He had to use words that more suited his belief that the team was alive, but still break the news to his men. Gunny Hinson and Sergeant Jones have been reported killed, he chose to say, adding the word reported, left open the possibility they were still alive. The room, which had gone quiet with the command, "Attention," grew deathly silent after the announcement. Captain Stewart scanned the room for reactions of the men. "Where are they, sir?" one Marine asked. They were reported captured while on their last mission. The report stated that captors killed them and made a public broadcast about having killed 2 snipers. "How do we know it was them, sir?" another Marine asked. The broadcast referenced the area in which Gunny Hinson and Sergeant Jones were hunting. They were the only military personnel in the area, so the conclusion is that it was them. The room remained quiet. Captain Stewart knew the men had questions, but it seemed as if they forced themselves to accept the news. He waited a few minutes, allowing the news to sink into the minds of his men. When the time passed and no one said anything, he added, "I've been instructed to ship their belongings home. If anyone would like to include a note to their families to let them know what Gunny Hinson and Sergeant Jones meant to you, I believe they will appreciate your words." When he mentioned the letters to the families, the shocked silence was pushed aside by low voices that discussed the 2 warriors who made up Team D.O.G and how much their friendship had meant. Captain Stewart could see their attitudes change, and he could tell most, if not all, would write letters to the families, and of this he was glad. Not only did he believe the families would appreciate their words, he trusted his Marines would benefit emotionally from writing them. Captain Stewart allowed the men to talk about their fallen friends a few minutes before calling the first sergeant forward. "First Sergeant, we have no mission except completing the letters to the families. Inform the men I'll be shipping the belongings in the morning. Instruct them to have their letters to me tonight so that I can pack them with the belongings." The first sergeant acknowledged Captain Stewart's instructions and faced the men to present the information. As he spoke, Captain Stewart turned and walked to his office, using this time to determine which Marines he would need on this mission. They were all excellent Marines, but he needed those with the skills required for the search and rescue mission he was planning. Knowing he didn't have all the skills necessary within his command, Captain Stewart began making mental determinations of where to find others needed for a successful mission. Following the incident with Rahim, Zach's and JJ's captors separated them, and though they were in different rooms, they could hear one another, which allowed communication and moral support, but it did nothing to help them keep warm. The nights were as cold as the days were hot, and since their captors took their clothing, they had no means to keep warm. JJ shivered. His body trembled so hard that he couldn't sleep, so he decided to talk to Zach. Several times, a guard threw open JJ's door, angrily burst into his room, waving his weapon, and threatened him when Zach and JJ's talking became so loud as to be heard. Though the guards didn't know what was said, they knew the 2 of them talking to one another was positive for their mental states, and they could not allow this, but the guards' outbursts didn't stop Zach and JJ. JJ had already seen how the guard had stopped his earlier attack, and he assumed that no matter how angry the guards became, they would not be permitted to injure them. He was convinced they would not be touched at all, until he heard the heated words yelled by the guard in Zach's cell. His friend screamed in pain, and JJ knew the guard was beating him. JJ stood and rushed to the door of his room. "Stop torturing him!" JJ pounded on the door, doing all he could to draw the guard's attention to him and away from Zach. The door flung open, and the guard rushed into the room, right past his prisoner. JJ quickly wrapped an arm around the guard's head and twisted it, and the bones in his neck snapped and severed his spine. JJ allowed the body to collapse to the floor and hurriedly closed the door to his room so no one outside it could see what had happened. He then dragged the body to an area where it could remain unseen by anyone looking through the small opening in the door. Once the body was out of sight, JJ searched the guard for anything he could use, retrieving a knife, some keys, and an AK-47. As a last step, he stripped the guard of his clothing. JJ secured everything and looked through the little opening in the door. A second guard had returned and yelled as he rushed through the door into Zach's room. JJ reacted quickly, needing to silence the guard, and fled from his room. He quickly overpowered the guard and plunged the knife through the back of his neck at the base of his skull. The guard went lifeless, and JJ lowered him to the ground and dragged him into his room. He then closed the door and stripped the man of his clothing and weapon. JJ used dirt from the floor to cover the trail of blood left by the guard's body. Then, as quietly as possible, entered Zach's room. "Put this on." He handed the clothing to Zach. "It'll keep you warm. It might even serve as a disguise." "What about you?" Zach asked. "I have extra, but I'm more concerned about keeping you warm. You aren't showing signs of shock, but the night is cold. We'll be outdoors in a few minutes." "I'm in no condition to move," Zach protested. "The guard rammed my broken leg with the butt of his gun. Go without me. You'll have a better chance alone." "Not going to happen. Once they see I'm gone, they'll kill you. How would I explain that to Jennifer?" JJ helped Zach get dressed, then put on the remaining clothing and began gathering the weapons. He was about to confirm that the blow to Zach's leg by the guard hadn't caused further damage, but the sound of the door opening made him pause. The leader of the group that had captured them walked into the room, laughing and pointing the HK-416 at them. "Is good," the man said in broken English. "American no quit," he said as he motioned to the men with him. Zach and JJ exchanged looks of shock by the sound of the English language coming from the leader's lips, as two men approached JJ and took the weapons from him. "What do you want with us?" JJ asked. "Who are you?" The man walked to Zach, knelt, and inspected his wounds. He then looked at JJ before standing, motioning, and issuing a verbal order in his native language to one of the men accompanying him. The man rushed from the room without hesitation. "Me, Ahmad Fad Assad," the leader said, continuing his broken English. "You kill, no noise. You close escape. You good." He pointed to his men. "Not so good. You caught." "Why are you holding us?" JJ asked again. "You kill Amir Salam Rahim. He enemy me. He friend." Assad abruptly stopped. "Me leader Abu Midian," he finally said. JJ recognized Abu Midian as the name of one of the prominent clans of the region. They were one of the more violent clans and one of the wealthiest. They had a history of making money from the poppy trade, but in recent years, they found a significant increase in wealth through the dealings of surplus Soviet arms, of which there seemed to be an endless need and an infinite supply. The ongoing conflicts in the region required a constant flow of weapons, which meant a steady stream of money into the Abu Midian clan. And their arms trade was made possible following the end of the Cold War, during which the former Soviet Union had manufactured or purchased millions of weapons. Now, it seemed, most of them were available on the illegal arms market. JJ's mistrust of his new captor increased. "Me friend, you president," Assad continued. "He friend me." JJ looked at Zach in utter shock, and the unspoken words between the two were those of disbelief. They knew the president was not as devoted to America and Americans as a president should be, but they never expected he would be friends with a terrorist leader. Yet, Assad freely admitted that he was a friend of the president. "You kill Rahim. You friend me," Assad said. JJ was certain he heard dishonesty in the words of friendship, but his thinking was interrupted when two men entered the room and began looking over Zach's leg. The men poked and prodded at Zach's broken leg and appeared to be making sure they didn't cause further damage. Zach winced and flinched with each touch by the inept medicine men. JJ decided they'd done enough damage. "Stop," he said in a demanding tone. "I can take care of him." JJ pushed the two aside and felt Zach's leg to determine just how much harm had been inflicted by the blows from the guards. Disgusted at what he found, he looked at Assad. "Your men have caused extensive damage to his leg. He needs a medical professional immediately." "Come," Assad finally said after several long moments, and he motioned for his men to help Zach. "You go, help friend." The men carefully lifted Zach and placed him on a makeshift litter. Zach grimaced in pain, but made no sounds. No doubt, he was determined not to allow his captors to know he was suffering. "Where are you taking us?" JJ asked. "Village," Assad answered. "What is the name of the village?" JJ persisted, knowing this information was vital to his and Zach's rescue. "Where is it?" His questions fell on deaf ears. Before they left the room, JJ counted his captors, and with the accurate number in mind, he began to devise a plan to break free of these men. While the guards escorted Zach and JJ from the room, he looked around for his equipment. He remembered the leader had not destroyed his radio, and he needed to find it, if it was in the building. He also wanted his HK-416, but the leader held it securely. Not seeing the equipment, he had to devise a way to get away from his captors and look further. He waited until the group was out of sight of his and Zach's rooms. "Wait, I must get something from my room." Assad stopped and looked at him. JJ pointed and walked toward the rooms. "I need it to help my friend's wounds." Assad continued to watch JJ, then motioned for two of his armed men to accompany him. JJ stepped through the door to his room, and the two men were right behind him. He listened to their footsteps and got a mental picture of their locations in his head, then quickly turned and slammed the door into the man closest to it. His first target stunned, JJ immediately thrust himself onto the other man and snapped his neck. He turned back to see the first man was staggering but raising his weapon. JJ dropped to the ground and kicked out, taking the man's feet from under him. Once the man hit the ground, JJ grabbed his head and twisted it. In less than 10 seconds, he had taken out his two guards and somehow managed it without either of the men shouting and alerting others. He grabbed their weapons and looked in the direction from which he had come. When he saw no one coming towards him, he quickly looked from room to room for his radio and any other weapons. He found them, just as Assad's patience was probably running out. JJ pulled a map that he'd placed in a pocket of the case and hid it in his clothing. He then turned on the radios to contact someone at his forward operating base. But before he could utter the first words, Assad shouted something to his men. JJ soon heard feet rushing through the building, so he put his radio and one of the weapons across his shoulders and carried the other weapon in the ready position as he left the room and walked to Assad's location. JJ pointed his weapon at Assad. "Order your men back." Assad shouted something. JJ didn't understand, but the words resulted in movement. The steps of Assad's men got louder as they ran to his location, but the two abruptly stopped when they saw a weapon pointed at their leader. "Tell them to put their weapons on the ground," JJ said to Assad. Assad did nothing. One of the men raised his weapons, so JJ turned and fired, killing him instantly. Apparently, JJ determined, Assad had no intention of following his instructions. And since he didn't want to have someone with a weapon in his hands ready to kill, JJ shot and killed the second. Assad burst into laughter, which confused JJ. "You brave," he said as his laughter subsided. He motioned to the front of the building. "But brave no good here." JJ turned as a group of men rushed into the building from the outside, each with a weapon aimed directly at his head, and his heart sank at the overwhelming show of force. He had found his radio and had weapons, but now they were useless. He dropped his weapons and the radio as the men surrounded him. Assad spoke some words JJ didn't understand, but his gestures made his meaning clear. Some of Assad's men took possession of his weapons and radio, and when Assad was satisfied, he spoke again, One man carried the radio outside and opened fire on it. 2 more men lifted Zach, and he and JJ began their journey to an unknown destination. The first thing JJ saw as they exited the building was the dozens of dead bodies lying on the ground. These had not been visible in the darkness when he and Zach were taken into the building, and he concluded that Assad's men had killed Rahim's men. JJ took note of the direction in which they were walking, and as the group walked, he kept a pace count. When they changed direction, he noted it and kept a count of the travel in that direction. He wasn't able to plot the course on his map, but he made sure to memorize everything so he could plot it when he was out of sight of Assad's men.